Ariel and I got to sit down with Peter Cardwell-Gardner, a South African dev now living in the UK who's behind the studio Made with Monster Love. After 13 years of hard work and development, he's finally on the verge of releasing Cadence, a game that's puzzles and music combined in one. Here's the interview.
Okay, to get us started, could I please ask that you just introduce yourself to those who might not know you and share a little bit about how your journey began? How do you go from living in South Africa to being a game developer? Was that something you always wanted to do with your life?
All right, certainly. So, hi, my name is Peter. I am a programmer, game developer, indie game dev. I also was involved in starting up Super Friendship Arcade, which has kind of morphed and evolved and now sort of has a home at Playtopia. How did I get into game development? By complete accident is the honest answer there. So, uh, originally I went to music college. I studied to become a sound engineer. I worked in a recording studio, and that was way back in the days of MySpace. So revealing my age there and my gray hairs. And in MySpace, you used to have to drop HTML into your profile to customize it. And that was really kind of the first point where I was like, oh, if I change this number, things happen. And, that curiosity then snowballed. That then eventually led me to working in advertising, or sadvertising, as some people might call it. I learned a lot about programming. It was very high paced. We were working on a lot of projects, and a lot of the projects we were working on was actually these sort of advert game kind of projects. So, I just really gravitated towards that, and I kind of became the person in the room who was always, if there was a games like project, they would kind of put me on it. So, but advertising is quite cynical, and I really wanted to make things that were, had lasting value and that, people actually cared about. So, yeah, it was really just a Google search. I typed in game developer South Africa, because at that point I had no concept that you could do game development in South Africa. It just, those two neurons hadn't even fired together. And then lo and behold, I found, the local game developer scene, and, that's where I met, people like Evan, who started Free Lives, and, found out that there was this whole community there. And, from that's really sort of, I was, falling rapidly down the cliff at that point, down the rabbit hole.
Can I just say, I've heard many game development origin stories, and you are the first person to find their origin with MySpace. I love it.
Yeah. So, I just think about all the things that, your parents tell you not to do, not to play video games and not to spend too much time on the internet. When I say, spend as much time as you want, you'll never know where it will take you.
Yeah.
And then, can you tell us a little bit more about Cadence? What inspired the core concepts behind the game? Was it your history with sound design? Because solve problems, make music, feel nourished aren't usually terms that you hear together every day when it comes to marketing a video game.
Yeah, absolutely. I think I probably should, if I was going to make my life easier, I should have picked more conventional terms, because it's definitely been a difficult project to speak about and to explain to people exactly what it is. I think we go back to that time, this was 2012, that time where I was in advertising. I was frustrated. I knew I wanted to kind of branch out and do my own thing. So I was playing with a lot of kind of indie jam game, game jams where you try and make a game in a short amount of time. And, actually the first project I had that sort of found success was I made a 7-day FPS horror game. And, it was, in those days, YouTubers were still looking for content. So that got played by a lot of YouTubers today who are now massive, like Markiplier. And I was like, oh, this seems pretty easy. I just make games and, they'll get picked up. And, that was something that I tried to develop further, but my interest wasn't there. So there's this great concept I think it's called Ikagi, which is try and make something that the world wants, try and make something that you're capable of making, and try and make something that interests you. And yeah, Cadence was a game jam project. It started as a 48-hour game jam. And originally it was just, I was trying to make a simple puzzle mechanic, because a lot of my game ideas at that stage were just too big. And, even with a massive team, they would have been really difficult to make. So, it's really the question of what can I as an individual do? So I found this puzzle mechanic, which was joining nodes together. And back then it was all 3D. It looked quite different. And really the music bit was an accident. So, I just put some tones on these nodes so that it would sound a bit more ambient and sound cool. And then realized that as you were playing different puzzles, or as you created different solutions, it was changing the music that was playing, and it was kind of generating these melodies. And that was really the sort of the curiosity hook of like, okay, how far can we take that? Can we turn this into something where you can actually play a game that makes music? I think where it's gotten to 13 years later, it's definitely, the music and the puzzles are deeply interlinked. And, in the sandbox, you can actually create music by using the rules of the game. But it is definitely a testament to my niche interests. It's kind of, all of my little quirks and oddities wrapped into one product. And, I'm sure there will be people out there who, share all of those interests, and this will be one of the best games they've ever played. But, for most people, they're either interested in the puzzles or they're interested in the sort of music sandbox side of it.
Yeah, it's I think that's where kind of indie studios almost shine these days. It's the developers kind of have this thing where they want to, it's their own quirks or their own interests or their own hobbies that they kind of put into their games, and then it comes out into something that there are other people out there that are like, oh, I actually have the same sort of interests and I haven't found a game like this. So that's why they pick up, and I think that's why the indie like dev environment has become such a big thing in the past couple of years, just finding those people to connect with.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, indie games are personal. And, I think that's something that, to be honest, in a lot of times over the development of the game I struggled with was, I always felt like I had to create this really positive story about the game, and, it's getting better and it's more awesome and you should buy it now. And, there were times where there wasn't much progress happening because, I was doing other jobs, or, I was a bit burnt out. But, I think really one of the reasons people love indie games is that, there's the developer's story there as well. And, I think, to be honest, I had to sort of integrate that a bit, was that actually, this is my story, and, to allow myself to be more personal and sort of be a bit more authentic about, this is me, these are my faults, but, here's the cool stuff as well.
These are my faults. Before we get into the meat of the interview, tell us, how does it finally feel to be releasing Cadence as a full game? After all the years spending time on it, what are the emotions, what are the feelings that you have now?
Yes, that's a really good question. I mean, my friend asked me, "Are you hyped?" And so I think my answer was, "Well, I'm about 10,000 emotions. I'm not sure hype is one of them just yet." So, no, it's definitely, it's been a very long journey. Sometimes it's been a real slog. There's been a lot of crisis moments where it's kind of, why am I still doing this? Is it going to be worth it? But I think overall, now the main feeling is I just feel really proud of myself. It's not many people can say that they've, kept up with something for so long. And that kind of does put me into, pretty rarefied group of people there. The main thing is I'm just happy I didn't take 14 years like Duke Nukem. So, we're not, we're not the longest development story ever. But yeah, no, I think the game is good now. And I think that was something where for a long time, the concept was good, but the game wasn't really backing that up. And, I think something that is difficult to reconcile is that the market is so different when I started working on this game to what it is now, and I think also I'm a different person. I was a baby when I started working on it, and now don't quite have a mortgage because I'm a game developer, but I've got responsibilities but I've also grown a lot and my skills have improved. So it's interesting to look at the game and sort of really see the growth and trajectory there, while at the same time, understanding that if this game came out 10 years ago, it would have probably been received in a very different way. Whereas now it's a real fight just to get it in front of people and to get them to even be aware of it.
But I think as hard as that is, it also has some payoff, because the people who do find it now are going to be your core audience. They are going to be the people who absolutely love it and want to tell their friends about it, because these small little indie gems are so much less frequent now than what they used to be. So they stand out more.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think there was a seminal moment for me in development where, this was maybe 6 years ago. I was really, so I had, the first version of Cadence was it looked beautiful. We'd put a lot of effort into it. This was about 2016, but the design of the game wasn't really working. As we try to make more levels, they just, we'd put them in front of people and people would just get confused, and we could see why they were getting confused. So, one of the reasons this took so long was I had to go back to the drawing board and say, okay, what's working, what's not working, and sort of reimagine the game in a lot of ways. And, in that process was very sort of, I was just, working away in my corner, and I had ideas to things that would improve the game, and it was kind of like redstone in Minecraft. And I was like, if I can get this to work in the game, it would be awesome. But it was very, I just felt like a mad genius in the cave. And I was like, well, maybe this is a crazy idea. I don't know. And then, I finally got those systems working, and I then got it in front of someone who is now a very good friend. Back then I didn't know him that well. And, he really got it, and he went into the sandbox and he just made these crazy things. And I was like, okay, there it is. I found my first super user and my first super fan. And this does actually make sense. I'm not crazy, this is a cool thing that I'm making. And I think that was really awesome. And, I think I've worked on a lot of games that have a creative element in them. So sandbox games. And for me, there's always a moment where you see someone make something that you didn't know was possible with the game. And you look at it and you're like, whoa, how did they do that? And then you kind of pick it apart and you're like, oh, this is amazing. So, I think there's been a few moments like that with beta testers where they've done stuff and I'm just like, okay, yeah, we've done a cool thing here. And I think that's something that I'm really excited to see now is once it's released, it finds its way into more people's hands like that. And yeah, I'm just really excited to see what happens. And I'm sure it's going to surprise me just as much as it's going to surprise other people.
But talking a little bit about this systems, you guys have made it very clear Cadence isn't your traditional rhythm game. I mean, technically you could play it with the sound off, even though absolutely do not do that. But how do you go about designing puzzles that feel incredibly musical without requiring musical skill from the players?
Yeah, that's a really good question. So I think it's a combination of two things. The first thing is just really trying to create good puzzle design. There are a lot of levels that I created that just had to go straight in the trash can. And then there's a lot of levels that just have that little sort of extra something and they come together really well. And, they challenge the player, but there's that unobvious aha moment that the player then gets, and then they feel awesome because they figured it out. And, ironically, a lot of the best puzzles are the ones that are the simplest. There's only a few elements on screen and you're like, oh, I feel really stuck here. And then, you sort of tease it out, and then it's, okay, there we go, we got it. So one of the things that's difficult about that is often what's good for a puzzle is not great for music. So, music wants a lot of repetition. It wants a lot of, 4 is like all pop music's kind of 4 to the floor. It wants these loops of 4 beats. So, the game does a lot of things to try and split the difference. So, for example, it will always use pentatonic scales because pentatonic scales sound good no matter what order you play the notes in. So it's little tricks like that where no matter which answer you come up with or which solution you come up with, it's still going to sound pleasant. But then there's also just a lot of manual massaging. So, I will kind of pick notes that kind of have a sort of vibe to them or a tone to them. So it's a lot of art meets technicality. And I think there's also a lot in the sound design. So all the music in Cadence is generated in real time by synthesizers. So there is a lot of, tweaking the synthesizer presets so that they sound interesting by themselves. And, it's funny, working on a music game over the years, I've had so many music people reach out to me and go, hey, love what you're doing. Do you need any music for the game? And I'm always like, no, the music generates all the game. There's no sort of pre-recorded music here. So yeah, I think, successfully bringing those two things together is one of the reasons why it's been such a complicated project. And, it took a lot of iteration to figure out how to actually make that work. But now, I think it really does work, and I'm really not only proud, but really happy with the end result.
I
mean,
that.
Was with the whole art, like meeting technicality thing, was it like a deliberate design choice to kind of reward the player's curiosity instead of punish them for missing out on puzzles? Was that something you went in from the get-go, or was it also something you just stumbled across when you had your beta testers in the sandbox?
No, I think it's been a choice from the very beginning to create a very, I think, first aesthetic experience. I really, the tone of the game has been a constant since the beginning. I think that comes down to a lot of the games I was inspired by. One of my favorite games is Journey. And Journey is a game that's beautiful, but it's also collaborative, and it's multiplayer, but they figured out how to make that a good experience. So I think that was the second pillar. It was always, I want this game to be generous to the player. But there are some things that I've had to let go of over time. So, I think in the first versions, I really wanted this to be a textless experience. I wanted it just to be something that was so intuitive that anyone could play it and figure it out. And I think over time, I kind of let go of that, and I was like, actually, this can get quite complicated, and having a bit of text there is important. So, I think something that I've worked on, incessantly over the years is the sort of first few tutorial levels, and I've probably play tested those 1,000 times. So, I've really tried to make it feel intuitive, and to sort of make it feel like both, when you say puzzle games, a lot of people, instantly go, oh, I'm not clever, or, that's not my thing. But you're really trying to strike that balance of, okay, so long as you're willing to give it a go, it's still accessible to you. Well, at the same time, there's a lot of people who are hardcore puzzle game players, and, they want to be entertained as well. So, it's managing that difficulty and sort of trying to provide for both is quite a tricky balance. I don't know how perfectly I've walked that, but, I guess we'll find out soon enough.
But one of my favorite parts of the game is the fact that it is designed almost to respect your time and to cater for busy people. Was that something that was shaped by your own life and work over the 13 years? Because we all know there's nothing worse than you're heavily invested in a game and then life happens, you can't play, come back a couple of weeks later and you're like, okay, well, might as well start over.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think for a long time now, I've been quite a busy person, and it's games come out and they're like it's 60 hours of content, and I'm just like, oh, I don't have 60 hours. I used to, I used to have school holidays, and it was awesome. But
Yeah.
but I think it's also more about just the state of the world. I feel like technology has gotten so much more intense, and my relationship with my phone has gotten very damaging in a way. It's constant notifications, constant news stories. So I think that was, like I mentioned, that's one of the reasons why the tone was so important for me. I wanted it to feel like a calm place, but also to not add to that noise. A lot of mobile games especially, they're trying to get you hooked and trying to get you come back and use all of these dark patterns. And, I understand why, that's that they want to make money, but for something that I'm putting out into the world, I don't want to create that experience. I don't want to add to it.
I love that. And that sort of ties into something I read in your press release, which was maybe we all need a little bit of delusion to do things that seem impossible. Is that something that you believed in the beginning and you've since thrown out, or is it still something that you really believe in is a requirement to make games like these?
I think it's definitely something I've arrived at rather than sort of started from. I think it's, I've been a software developer now in a professional capacity for a long time. And, there's a sort of notorious thing that software developers are bad at estimates. And, I think it's not just software developers. You see it with any complex project, any sort of big civil engineering project or building.
Yeah.
They're always over time and over budget. And, I think it's just this truism that if we were completely honest about how much effort was involved, then, it would probably be too scary for us to start in the first place. But that's, I think once you start, you begin to learn things, and you begin to find, discover that it is possible, and you kind of, that motivates you to push and to go further. And I think you really see that in the kind of text from the main character. So, the text was something that hasn't existed in the game until literally a couple of months ago. And, that was really a thing where I'd sort of had the idea at the back of my mind, but I'd always pushed it off as like, that's out of scope, that's out of scope, that's out of scope. And eventually it was like, no, this is my game. This has been a real journey. I want to put some of that in there. So I think, the text that the character says to you really kind of reflects how, the journey has evolved over 13 years of development. It's a lot about just getting started and kind of, trying again. And even when it feels like it's not working, keep on going.
I mean, speaking about it not going well or, keeping on, how have you managed to kind of keep yourself away from burnout, having to develop a game? A lot of the indie devs we speak to, especially the local ones, because they have to, do a full-time job, and then developing the game is something that's a bit of a side hobby. What kind of tricks or tips or what do you do in your life to help protect yourself from something like burnout?
That's a really good question. And I'm not sure I'm the fountain of authority, because for a long time I would just burn out, recover, burn out, recover. No, but I think, like I said, I've grown up a lot since I started working on it. And a lot of that growth has come from, being in therapy, which is privileged, but, it really helped me. And I think, a lot of that journey and self-discovery was about learning to let go a bit. I think one of the reasons burnout happens is because you push yourself to the point of burnout. And, often burnout happens because you feel like you don't have a choice. And, I think especially where you're trying to work on something you really care about outside of work, it it squeezes you in and you feel like, oh, I've got no time, and it puts so much pressure on yourself to make progress, to be efficient, to keep going. So, I think one of the main ways I've managed that is just to take breaks from the project. And, sometimes those breaks have been years at a time. And that's quite frustrating for, myself and for the players. But, ultimately, for the sake of my mental health, that's allowed me the perspective to come back to the project and to see it with fresh eyes and to actually make better decisions and to, build a better game ultimately.
Yeah. I also find a lot of the time, like just taking a step back from the project allows you to see things, like you said, a little bit differently. Maybe you're stuck trying to code in something that you wanted to, and you're just hitting against your head against the wall. And taking that break allows your brain to kind of relax and reset and come in at a different angle, and then kind of show that you can achieve what you were hoping to. You don't
Yeah,
have to brute force it.
absolutely. I mean, I have one moment that really sticks in my mind. So I think this was 2016, and this was when I was really super burnt out. I was, it was that version of the game that I said wasn't really working. And I was showing the game at a maze in Berlin. And, there was this guy who was playing it, and, he was really into it. And he took his headphones off and he turned to me and he said, "Oh, that was really awesome. I love it." And I just couldn't comprehend why he would love this game that I was so caught up about. And, in time, I had to sort of stop and go, well, actually, he's played the best version of the game that's ever existed,
Yeah.
Of course, why wouldn't he love it? So, I think by taking breaks, you then come back to it and you kind of almost surprise yourself and you're like, oh, this is really good. Like, this is so much better than I remember it. But it's because you remember the frustration of the thing you were trying to solve rather than the progress that you've made till that point in time.
True.
But also, I think you sort of, like when you work on a project, you were there through every single version, every single struggle, every single late night. A gamer is coming in and it's the first time they're experiencing it. It's like when you cook food, it never tastes as good for you as it does for the other people eating it, because you've been standing there, you've been working on it. By the time it's time to eat, you're just like, oh, I'm over it now.
Yeah, that's so true. I mean, I was away with friends this weekend, and literally that exact dynamic of like every cook was like, oh, it's not that good. And everyone else was like, I love it. It's delicious. Give me more.
So I know at the start of this, you spoke about South Africa's sort of like indie scene that not a lot of people know about when it comes to game development. It often flies under the radar. Do you feel like being involved in that, even temporarily, influenced Cadence and the project and where it is now?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. I mean, there's no doubt, that the project wouldn't exist if I hadn't found the scene, not just from, enthusiasm and friendships and support, but, also, Rodane was originally a collaborator on the project. So Rodane was the designer who created Desktop Dungeons, which was a very successful South African game. He also used to be a NAG contributor quite a long time ago. So they were a part of me really sort of trying to go for Cadence for real and to, give it our best shot and swing the bat as hard as we could. Obviously that didn't work out, and, we kind of made the very difficult decision to sort of part ways. And, I think they've moved on to other things, and they've, discovered themselves in lots of different ways too, and grown up in lots of ways. So, I think that's a key part. I think there's also, I found a lot of support, people who really wanted to see me succeed. So I'm very grateful for that support. Nice. But yeah, I mean, I think definitely what you just mentioned there, people aren't very aware of it. And it's been interesting because I've been able to compare the South African scene to the UK scene, and, UK has a much more established games industry. There's a lot of like really big studios here. That does make it easier to, find a career in games development, but it hits different. I think there's a lot more, I don't know if I would call it cynicism in the UK, but there's a lot less inspiration. There's a lot more,
Mhm.
you know, jadedness. Oh, we've seen this before. Nothing's exciting. And, that was very different in South Africa. In South Africa, there was a real sense of optimism and community and, this is awesome. We're doing cool things. So I think in a lot of ways, I actually really miss the South African scene. And, for anyone who doesn't know, Playtopia happens once a year in Cape Town. And I think that is the South African scene at its best. And now I'm at the point where I speak to a lot of international developers and they're like, oh man, I really want to go to Playtopia. And, they absolutely should because it is awesome. And, there's really cool stuff happening in South Africa.
I think it's
I
a
love that.
strong South African trait to just be so optimistic, and everything we do is just like very cool. I don't know if it's because we're all the way down here in the south where we don't have access to a lot of things, but yeah, I love the South African kind of gears that we have. Yeah, it's
Yeah,
very different
absolutely.
from the
And
rest of the world.
I absolutely know what you're talking about. We have that feeling of we're a long way from everything and we kind of have to, overcompensate in some way. But like,
Yeah.
I think, that is also strength. Definitely in the South African indie scene, there was much more focus on sort of how to survive as an indie and, being sort of ruthlessly efficient with like what you have, which is not a lot of resources and, really validating your games and figuring out that there's an audience for them. And that focus, I haven't really seen nearly as much of that in the sort of UK scene. So I think, South Africans do kind of sell themselves short, but, they have so much to offer and so much resources and resilience, which is awesome.
But speaking about having so much to offer, if you could go back now and speak to the past version of you who thought this would be a quick, easy 6-month project, what would you tell him?
I would say run, and then he would ignore me anyway. Which is funny. I actually, there was a game I was inspired by called Fract OST, which was like a first person game where the whole world was musical, and that was a game I was like, oh, they've done all these cool things. I want to do all these cool things. And, I met the developer of that game and he said that pretty much the same thing to me. It's music games are hard. Don't do it. And I did it anyway. So, yeah, I mean, I think what I would say is that like, I think the one thing I would say is like, there was a lot of doubt along the way. And I would just say like, hey, you got this. It's going to be awesome.
Finally, now that Cadence is going to be out in the world, what do you hope players will kind of gain from the game? Once they put the controller down and they take those headphones off, what are you hoping that they kind of feel?
That's a really good question. I mean, obviously, I hope they've had a good time.
Sure.
No, but I think, one of the core messages of the game is really about self-acceptance. And, that's maybe not so much through the puzzles themselves, but it's through, the aesthetic and through the sort of story text that you get. So, I think that won't touch everyone, but, I'm hoping there will be a few people who that will be the message that they needed to hear at the right time. And, if even there's one or two people like that, then that's worth it.
Success.
And then just a few quick fire questions. What games do you enjoy playing when you are not working?
That's a really good question. So I feel like I have less and less time for games these days. And then I stop and think about it. It's like, no, actually, I do play more games than I give myself credit for.
Okay.
I think two of the games I play the most are sim racing and Rocksmith, which is like Guitar Hero with a real guitar. And I'm
Yeah.
like, are those games or are those just, training tools for
Games?
other hobbies? But yeah, no, I still play indie games. I think really beautiful, creative games still speak to me. So Cocoon and Gris were two games I played recently. Kind of games who have art that I wish I was capable of making, but I'm a programmer, so I just get jealous and I'm envious of what they can do.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think I'll leave my answer there. Mhm.
Cool. And also, what is the next 13-year project for Made with Monster Love?
Yes.
Cool. Yeah, I suppose we gotta wait and see how this one goes before we move on, right?
Yeah, it was like asking someone who's just about to give birth when they're going to have their next kid. We'll see what happens.
And then just to close things out, can you tell people online how they can find you, how they can find Cadence if they want to check out the game for themselves?
Absolutely. So if you're on a PC or a Mac, yeah, Steam is the best place to go. So if you just search Cadence Steam, you'll find us there. It's also on the App Store. I am on Blue Sky as the Fantastic, although don't expect me to post very often. And we also have a Discord where if you really want to get involved and following what's happening with the game, from the Steam page, you'll be able to find the Discord.
Thank
Cool.
you so much. And thank you for taking the time to speak with us today. It was really great. It's always fun to talk to fellow South Africans.
Always.
Yeah, that was really excellent. And yeah, thank you for taking the time to listen to me waffle, but I really enjoyed it.